February 12, 1945. Somewhere along the frozen edges of the Moselle River, western Germany. The wind cuts like steel across the valley. Snow falls in thin, relentless sheets, dissolving into the gray mud churned by tank treads and boot heels. A group of 47 German prisoners shuffles eastward under American guard, their heads low, their hands bound with whatever rope or wire the victors could spare. Among them is a woman. She wears the faded gray uniform of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, though it no longer fits the way it once did. Her cheeks are hollow, her fingers swollen and raw from frostbite. She cannot feel them anymore. She stumbles. A corporal from Iowa catches her elbow before she hits the ground. He says something in English soft, impossible to understand. She does not reply. She has stopped speaking days ago. The other prisoners do not look at her. They cannot afford to. Survival, in these final months of the war, is measured in silence, in the ability to become invisible. But the corporal does not let go. He kneels in the mud beside her, unbuckles a cloth pouch from his belt, and begins to wrap her hands. His movements are slow, deliberate, almost reverent. She stares at him as if he were a ghost. She does not understand. She has been taught for 12 years that the enemy is brutal, that the Americans are savages, Jews and capitalists who would tear Germany apart. Yet here, in the cold, a man she does not know wraps her frozen hands as if they were his own. This moment, this small, unremarkable act of mercy, will haunt her for the rest of her life. By the winter of 1945. The war in Europe had entered its final, desperate phase. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army pushed westward through Poland and East Prussia, leaving scorched earth and mass graves in its wake. In the west, Allied forces had breached the Siegfried Line and were pouring into the German heartland. The Rhine, that ancient border of civilization and barbarism, would soon be crossed. For the German people, the propaganda they had consumed for over a decade was beginning to crack. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, had warned them endlessly of what would come if Germany lost. The Americans, he said, would enslave the German race. The British would burn their cities. The Soviets would exterminate them. Every leaflet, every broadcast, every rally had hammered this message into the national psyche. Better death than defeat. And for years, the people believed it. They had to. Belief was the only currency left, but belief is a fragile thing when it meets reality. The woman, her name was Ilse Hartmann. Though she would not speak it aloud for weeks, had joined the Reichsarbeitsdienst in 1942. Not out of ideological fervor, but out of necessity. At 23, she had lost her father to the Eastern Front and her brother to the bombing of Hamburg. Her mother had died of pneumonia that same winter. The labor service offered food, shelter, and purpose. She dug trenches, cleared rubble, planted vegetables in the scarred earth outside Trier. She did not think about politics. She thought about surviving until spring. When the Americans came, she expected nothing. She had heard the stories, how the Soviets raped and murdered their way through the villages of East Prussia, how the Americans handed cigarettes to children before shooting their fathers. She had been told these things by officers, by neighbors, by the radio. She had no reason to doubt them. So when the corporal wrapped her hands, she could not reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught. The bandages were clean. His hands were steady. He did not look at her with hatred or lust or contempt. He looked at her the way one might look at a younger sister, with concern, with patience, with the unspoken understanding that she was suffering. She wanted to thank him. But the words would not come. The treatment of prisoners of war by the United States military in 1945 was governed by the Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. had ratified in 1929. Under these rules, prisoners were to be treated humanely, given adequate food and medical care, and protected from violence and humiliation. In practice, The enforcement of these standards varied widely depending on the theater of war, the unit in question, and the temperament of individual commanders. But there was something deeper at work than mere adherence to international law. American soldiers, particularly those who had been raised during the Great Depression, carried with them a set of values that were distinctly democratic in nature: fairness, decency, the belief that even an enemy, once defeated, deserved a measure of dignity. This was not universal. There were atrocities. There were abuses, but it was common enough to be remarked upon by prisoners across Europe. A German officer, captured near Aachen in October 1944, later wrote in his diary, "I expected to be beaten. I expected to starve. Instead, they gave me coffee and a cigarette. The coffee was terrible, but it was real. I could not understand it." Another prisoner, a 19-year-old conscript from Bavaria, recorded his first meal in American captivity: white bread, canned meat, cheese, more food in one sitting than I had seen in a month. I wept, not from gratitude, but from shame. We had been told they were the barbarians. For Ilse Hartmann, the moment of dissonance came not with food, but with touch. The corporal's hands on hers, the bandages, the lack of cruelty. She had been prepared for brutality. She had not been prepared for kindness. The column of prisoners was marched to a processing camp near Koblenz, where the Rhine bent sharply to the west. The camp was little more than a cluster of canvas tents surrounded by barbed wire, but it was dry, and there were stoves. Ilse was separated from the male prisoners and placed in a smaller enclosure with 11 other women, most of them also from the labor service, a few from auxiliary units of the Luftwaffe. They did not speak to one another. Trust had become a luxury none of them could afford. On the third day, an American medic came to examine them. He was young, perhaps 25, with red hair and a face full of freckles. He moved through the tent with a clipboard and a stethoscope, checking pulses, listening to lungs, making notes in English. When he reached Ilse, he paused. Her hands were still wrapped in the bandages the corporal had given her, but the fabric was stained now with blood and pus. The frostbite had worsened. He knelt beside her, just as the corporal had done, and began to unwrap the bandages. She flinched. He stopped, looked her in the eye, and said something soft in English. Then he continued, more slowly. When the bandages came off, she saw that 2 of her fingers on her left hand had turned black. The medic said something to another soldier who brought over a basin of warm water and a towel. He soaked her hands, he cleaned them. He applied ointment and fresh bandages. And when he was done, he gave her a tin of hand cream, American hand cream, with a label she could not read, but a scent she would never forget. Lavender and something sweet, like vanilla. She looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, she wept. The symbolic power of abundance cannot be understated in the American experience of the Second World War. While Europe starved, America thrived. While German factories crumbled under Allied bombs, American factories produced tanks, planes, ships, and guns at a rate unmatched in human history. While German soldiers ate sawdust bread and potato soup, American G's carried chocolate bars, canned fruit, and white bread in their packs. This was not accidental. It was the product of a nation that had, in the span of 5 years, transformed itself from an isolationist republic into the arsenal of democracy. The American economy, once crippled by the Depression, had roared to life under the demands of total war. And the soldiers who carried that abundance with them into Europe, into the ruins of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, the rubble of Berlin, became the living embodiment of a different world. For Ilse Hartmann, the hand cream was not just a medical tool. It was a message. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to give you this. We are not like you. We do not hoard. We do not ration our humanity." She kept that tin for the rest of her life. The camp at Koblenz was only a temporary holding facility. Within 2 weeks, Ilse and the other women were transferred to a larger POW camp near Reims, France. The conditions there were better wooden barracks instead of tents, regular meals, access to washing facilities. The American soldiers who guarded them were professional, distant, but not unkind. They did not mock. They did not abuse. They simply did their jobs, but the psychological adjustment was harder than the physical one. Ilse had spent 12 years living in a totalitarian state where every aspect of life was controlled, monitored, and directed by the party. The Nazis had told her who to hate, what to believe, how to live. And now suddenly, that entire structure had collapsed. She was free, but freedom felt like vertigo. She began to talk to the other women. Slowly, hesitantly. They shared stories of what they had lost, what they had seen, what they had believed. Most of them had been true believers once. They had sung the Horst Wessel-Lied with fervor, had wept when the Führer spoke, had convinced themselves that they were part of something glorious. Now they did not know what to believe. One woman, a schoolteacher from Leipzig, said quietly one evening, "We were lied to. About everything. But the worst lie was that they were monsters. They're just men." Ilse thought of the corporal, the medic, the hand cream. She thought of the care they had shown her, not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. And she realized with a clarity that felt like grief that she had been wrong. Not just about the war, but about the world. The transformation of German POWs in American captivity was not instantaneous, nor was it universal. Many prisoners remained loyal to the Nazi cause, clinging to the belief that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to process the scale of what had happened. But for a significant number, particularly those who had been exposed to American abundance and American values, the experience of captivity became the beginning of a re-education. The United States military implemented a program known as intellectual diversion, which exposed prisoners to democratic ideals through films, lectures, and discussions. They were shown newsreels of the liberation of the concentration camps. They were given copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They were encouraged to debate, to question, to think critically. For many, this was the first time in their lives they had been allowed to do so. Ilse attended one of these lectures in the spring of 1945. An American officer, a former professor of history, spoke about the origins of democracy, the importance of individual rights, the dangers of authoritarianism. He did not condemn the German people. He condemned the ideology that had led them into darkness. She listened. And she began to understand. By the time Ilse was released from captivity in late 1946, Germany was a ruin. The cities were rubble. The economy was non-existent. Millions were homeless, orphaned, starving. She returned to Trier to find that her childhood home had been reduced to a crater. There was no family left to return to. She found work with the Red Cross, helping to reunite displaced families. She learned English. She read everything she could find: books that had been banned, newspapers that told the truth, letters from survivors of the camps. She forced herself to see what she had refused to see before. And every night, before she went to sleep, she opened the tin of hand cream. It was empty now, had been for years, but she kept it anyway. It reminded her of the moment when the world had stopped making sense, and then, slowly, began to make sense again. There's a photograph, taken somewhere in the chaos of 1945, of an American soldier kneeling beside a German prisoner. The soldier is wrapping the prisoner's hands. The prisoner's face is obscured, but her posture speaks of exhaustion, of surrender, of something deeper than defeat. It is not a famous photograph. It was never published in the major newspapers. But it exists, buried in the archives of the National World War II Museum. catalogued and forgotten. History is made of millions of such moments, small, quiet, unremarkable acts that nonetheless shift the course of a life. The corporal who wrapped Ilse Hartmann's hands did not know that he was changing her. He was simply doing what he had been taught to do: treat others with dignity, even when they are your enemy. Especially when they are your enemy. This is the quiet power of democracy. Not the power of armies or factories or bombs, but the power of decency. The belief that every person, no matter their uniform or their past, deserves to be treated as a human being. Ilse Hartmann lived until 2003. She married an American soldier, not the corporal, but a lieutenant she met while working for the Red Cross. She moved to Pennsylvania, raised 3 children, and became a naturalized citizen. She never spoke publicly about her time in captivity, but her children remember the tin of hand cream on her nightstand, and the way she would sometimes hold it in her hands, turning it over and over as if it contained something precious. When she died, they buried the tin with her. Epilogue. War is a contest of ideologies as much as it is a contest of arms. The Nazis believed that power was the ultimate truth, that the weak existed to serve the strong, that mercy was a weakness to be exploited. The Americans believed something different. They believed that power was meaningless without principle, that strength was measured not by cruelty but by restraint, that the true test of a civilization is how it treats those who have no power left. In the winter of 1945, those two ideologies met on a frozen riverbank. One was embodied by a woman who could not feel her hands, the other by a soldier who wrapped them anyway. History remembers the tanks and the battles, the generals and the speeches, but it is built on moments like this, small acts of grace that echo across decades, that remind us that even in the darkest times, there is light. Even in war, there is humanity. Even in defeat, there is hope. Because freedom is not just the absence of tyranny. It is the presence of decency. And decency, more than any weapon, is what wins the peace. The wind still blows across the Moselle. The snow still falls. But the hands, once frozen, are warm.